suppose if this has a title, I'll call it Led into Gold, What Christ Does in the Ordinary Things of Life. Now, at Mike's wedding, Mike Wells that is, I believe some words of advice were given to Lucy, and they were tips from a 1950s home economics book. And they go a bit like this. I'm not sure if this is the exact book that she used. Have dinner ready. Number 2, prepare yourself. Number 3, clear away clutter. 4, prepare the children. 5, minimise noise. Some don'ts. Number 7, make him comfortable. And number 8, listen to him. And number 9, make the evening his. It sounds great, doesn't it? And my favourites are, in the prepare yourself, take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair and be fresh looking. He has just been with a lot of work-weary people. Say that again. Be a little gay and a little more interesting. His boring day may need a lift. That's one of my favourites. And my next one is, have him lean back in a comfortable chair or suggest he lie down in the bedroom. Have a cool and warm drink ready for him. Arrange his pillow and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low and soft, soothing voice and pleasant voice. Allow him to relax and unwind. Is this real? And my third favourite is, listen to him. You may have a lot of things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Now, that's the rules of the 1950s. Here's an alternative. It's written by the first American poet, a lady called Anne Bradstreet. And believe it or not, this was written in the mid-1600s, so 400 years ago nearly. And she was a Puritan exile from the UK. Her father was a lord, and they left England because of religious persecution to have a new life in the new world. And it was pretty hard over there. There's a lot of disease, dysentery, starvation, but they did that because they were fleeing persecution. But she wrote this because she went with her husband. She wrote this about him. If ever two were one, then surely we. If ever man were loved by wife, then thee. If ever wife was happy in a man, compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold, or all the riches that the east doth hold. My love is such the rivers cannot quench, nor aught but love from thee give recompense. Thy love is such I can no way repay. The heavens reward thee manifold, I pray. Then while we live, in love let's so persevere, that when we live no more, we may live ever. Now, you spot the difference between them. The one is a set of rules. It could be followed by anything and anybody. It could be a very rich husband with a wife who's very young, the husband's 95 and she's home for the will. Or he could be a terrifying brute, or it could be a robot. It doesn't really matter. She could do all these things. But the other is a woman who is in love with her husband. She doesn't need any of these rules because there is no limit to what she will do to please him. She is rejoicing and exulting in the state, her privilege that she has that husband. And so we're going to come on to this tonight. Last week Rod spoke in the morning on these verses of 12 to 17 in this chapter. And if you couldn't listen, it's well worth listening because it's online. Now what he said provides the basis and the context for everything we're going to cover tonight. So first of all, the context. In chapter 3 it tells us about who we are in Christ. If we're Christians, we have a new life. We are new people and we have a new relationship, a new state in Jesus. And then the rest of the chapter is working out, well, what does this mean? How does this work out in our lives? So initially Paul covers the negatives, things, attitudes and actions that are incompatible with who we are in Jesus if we trust him. But he proceeds on to what Rod discovered and discussed. He first made the observation, which when you think about it is quite true, that many sermons and teachings focus on negatives. But for all of these negatives, there are positives which we don't often discuss. And it is these which express most fully our new life in Jesus. Because the qualities or graces that are listed in this chapter are those of Christ, and these are ones we are to imitate. These are characteristics of who those who know and love Jesus are to carry out. They consist of things like compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, and above all love. And these are the things that Rod was saying, that these are the things we should have, and these should be we seeking after. These are the people we should want to be. Now, tonight we're going to carry on from that and see, well, that's fine, it's fairly general, I kind of agree with all that, but how does this work out in our everyday lives? Is this a bit too good to be true? And in these 9 short verses, we're going to see some of the most challenging verses in this book. It's not that they're hard to interpret. There's no great discussion about what text means. It's not they're theologically profound. There's some great depths of understanding we need to work out what they're saying. They're easy words, they're easy to understand, but they're hard to do. And I think I'd speak for myself, and I think most preachers do, is that they're rather not preach on this passage actually, because they realise that whatever they say, they're going to get home, and perhaps they're well aware that they're not the people who should have been preaching this because they don't really match up to it. Mike said to me this morning, it's one that unmarried people avoid because they don't know anything about marriage or family, and married people avoid because they realise they don't live up to it. So this week we're going to deal with this passage. Now, in our Bibles, it's headed, this rather unhelpful note, which says Instruction for Christian Households. It's not really very helpful, because it's not that we're going to discuss now for something completely different. This is just following on quite naturally from what happened before. The other thing is, these are not rules. These are the outworking of our new identity. These are things we do because we love Jesus. Now, in the history, it is true, in the world of that time, households were not the nuclear family that we have today. They were everybody in the household. They could be servants, they could be children, they could be parents. So they're a lot bigger institution, and they were the bedrock of society. And some people have made the link saying, well, this is about that kind of thing. Sometimes in these families, the head of the house might have been a lady, as with Lydia. And some of these instructions resemble codes in Greek and Jewish and Roman writings of the time, but are actually quite different. Because this is not about a household and how it lives. This is an instruction to people in these situations, because the servants may not have had Christian masters. The children may have had unbelieving parents. The wives may have had unbelieving husbands, but it is still for them, and for every one of us in that same situation, it's true for us. But this subject is so ordinary, even though it's mentioned a lot of times in the New Testament. There are 2 approaches to it. The one is we focus on the bits in a very specific and unhelpful way. We actually put it in a kind of cultural way. So I guess if in the 1950s we'd have latched on to this husbands and wives thing, that wives, you do what your husband says, you make sure he's got a soft pillow and everything else like that. And that's the way it would be taken. So we import and bring in other things that the Bible does not say, because it happens to be the way we think. So that's one way that sometimes it's taken. Other times it's overlooked completely, which because either we want to avoid it because we don't want to talk about it, or because we don't think it's very important. It's not very spiritual, don't you know? We've got to talk about evangelism, we can talk about our walk with God, we talk about all these things, but somehow we don't think these things are very important at all. But no, Paul discusses this before. It's his first application that he deals with, because if this is wrong, then it's hard to see anything else going really right afterwards. Because he's discussing here how our identity changes when we're saved. Now, earlier on, Paul has said that there are no distinctions in the Christian world. So there is neither slave nor freeman, there is neither race, there's neither language. We're all one in Jesus. And he's also said that we're to clothe ourselves with humility, that we're put on love, we're all members of Christ's body. But how does this work out in everyday life? Does this mean that absolutely every distinction in life is gone? And clearly, he's not saying that. What he is saying that is, whilst we have submission one to another, they apply in different ways. We have to work out from this passage how this happens in everyday life. So, how do we serve each other, mutually serve one another in these different ways, in these different contexts? I think the other thing is that these areas, the marriage, the home and work, cover the places where Christians fall short. These are the areas where we are most exposed to who we really are, because in these places there are no hiding places. Workers are under the observation of their masters or their employers, and it doesn't matter what they say their Christian profession is, their masters have made up their own view from the way they see their employee working. The husband may be very busy preaching or going out or doing all sorts of things, but his wife sees him when he comes home and how he behaves at home. The children may have a very respectful father, but the way he treats them at home shows to all them the reality of his Christian faith. And so these are important here because they really show who we are in practice. This is where the reality of our faith is revealed, because there should be fruits to it in all these areas. So the first bit is Christ in the marriage, and it's a very simple one. It says, "Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord." So this is actually showing in the husband and wife there is a mutual submission to each other, but it's expressed in different ways. So here, the wives submit to your husbands. Now the word is stronger, a bit stronger than being devoted, but it's not as strong as being obeying, because submission is one willingly. The submission is completely voluntarily. It is something the wife chooses to do. It's not she's forced to do it, not she has to do it because she wants to do it. And hopefully in marriage, the union is such that husband and wife will agree and be one. Sometimes the husband may have to take the lead. And in that case, she is behind him in this. She may not always agree with what he says, but she will voluntarily put down maybe her opinions. She may express her opinions, but she will voluntarily support him. Notice also the second thing is, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands, or in some versions, your own husbands. It doesn't say submit to any other man. And some people have this cranky idea that somehow women have to submit to all men, which is complete nonsense. The woman is there to submit to her own husband. Not to any other husband, not to any other man. She's to submit to her own husband. And then the thing is the why. Why should she do this? Because it says, as is fitting in the Lord. So why do we do it? Is because for Jesus' sake. That's what Paul is saying. It's got nothing to do with the idea that a woman is inferior to a man, or a man is superior or stronger, or that women are more subservient, or it's got nothing to do with that at all. People bring all this stuff into it, but it's nothing to do with that. The woman is doing it for the Lord's sake. She may well be cleverer than her husband. She may well be more accomplished than her husband, but she's doing it for the Lord's sake. And the reason behind this is to do with a thing called the Bible calls headship. Something which, it's something, don't get me wrong, I don't like getting up here and talking about headship because I don't like being in charge. But a man has responsibility, the Bible says, to be the leader in his home. Not necessarily he gets his way all the time, but he has to sometimes take the lead. And this is simply not something that the Bible says because it is so. It's a reflection, it's a picture of the relationship of Jesus Christ and the church. The relationship between husband and wife is the same relationship between Jesus and his church and his people. And so you can think about it, is that the way the wife acts in a home is like a parable of what the much bigger cosmic picture of Christ and his church. Now, when it says in the Lord, it isn't actually saying, well, you obey your wife, you obey your husband when he's doing what you think the Bible says. In other words, I'll only do it when I agree with him. Although he would say you are never to do anything which is wrong. It is not saying here that the husband has absolute control to make you do everything and anything he decides to do, whether it's wrong or right. If it's dangerous for you, or if it's a risk to yourself and your husband, your children, that is beyond the limits of what is allowed. Now, the next one is reciprocal. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Remember, I spoke about mutual service. This is how men serve their wives. If you think at the moment, males, that men who are married, that you've got an easy pass, just hear on. Because the love there is not eros, it's not romantic love. It's not make sure your wife has flowers and make sure, of course, I'm sure she likes flowers, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. But what it's saying is, the word is agape, which is the Christian love. It's a self-sacrificing love. The love of the husband's devotion is such that he puts all his wife's needs above his own, his wants above his own. His care for her is giving and sacrificial. It's not so that he will gain brownie points or she will love him more. He does it sacrificially because that is the love he should show to his wife. His desire is to please her, and that should override his own wishes or wants. And then it says, do not be harsh. Now, obviously it means that there is no place for harshness in the husband's treatment of his wife. That is adamant, that is certain, that is something the husband should never ever do. But you think, well, why should the husband ever be harsh against his wife? I think because sometimes husbands do take out we do on those who are nearby to us, we take out our frustrations on other people, whether they're justified or not. And so he is saying here, when you have a disagreement, you're not to ride roughshod over her wishes. So that's the marriage. The next one is the home. So it says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. So again, we've got this thing, this pleases the Lord. First of all, it's talking about Christian children, those who are living under the parents' roof. And the word is obey for those. It's not just simply respect, but it's obey. And of course, again, I'd echo, it's not you obey your parents to do anything. If they're going to get you to rob banks or things like that, you don't do that, obviously. These are things you don't do anything which is wrong. And again, why should you do this? Well, surprise, because this pleases the Lord. You see the pattern coming along here. And the reciprocal one for fathers is, fathers, do not embitter your children. In other words, your parents' desires are what is best for their children. Now, sometimes you appreciate that what you think is best for your children is not appreciated. It's possibly not what the children want. Sometimes it seems very hard for them. Sometimes you have to tell them not to do things which you know are bad for them, and it's very hard for them and you. But it's not an authoritarian, tyrannical, sort of Victorian kind of discipline. It's not needlessly imposing unnecessary burdens on the children, because they can be discouraged. Discouraged from what? Because as Christian parents, I think all of us, the greatest desire we have for our children is not that they go to Oxford or win Nobel Prizes, is that they become Christians and know Jesus for themselves. And so in seeking to bring children to the Christian faith, we try to avoid anything unnecessary that will make their Christian lives or their coming to faith more difficult than it need be. So the third one, the workplace. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it, not only when their eye is on you, and to curry their favour, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Now, just a little word first of all. We use the word slave here. Other translations use bondservant, some even use servant. And some people get very high horse about this. It means slaves, and that's all it means. So first in this discussion, the word doulos can mean different things in context, and I'll come to that in a second. But the trouble with the word slave, it has a very definite word in our modern thinking. We tend to think of the evils of North American slavery. In those days, slavery wasn't racial. People could be slaves of any country. People were caught by pirates. Sometimes they were captured in war. Sometimes parents even sold their children into slavery. Think of that. Slaves might be married. They might have children. And they could have all sorts of high-profile positions. They could be teachers. They could be accountants. They could be physicians. They could be cooks, or hairdressers. But I think the word is more flexible than just slaves. the English Standard Bible Translation Committee had a huge debate about this, and they came to the conclusion that bondservant could be a better term, because you have to take it in its context. Because, for instance, if you're interested, if you look at 1 Corinthians 7 verses 21-24, it talks about slaves. It says, don't make yourselves bondservants, because people could sell themselves for a limited period of time. Indentured service was something which happened even until the sort of 17th century in this country, where people could sell their services for a fixed time, 7 years maybe, and actually make themselves bondservants. Now, why am I saying all this? Because it's all very interesting, but not really much to do with this passage. The reason I say is because some people say, well, slaves, this passage has got nothing to do with Christians in the workplace, because these are slaves, and actually, you are, in your modern day, you are not technically slaves, because you are not owned by anyone. Now, that's the point. The point is that this is a service which is owed to someone. The focus in here is not about being someone else's property. It's whatever their state, they were the Lord's freemen. The point is, it is their service and their work for someone else. So today, in my employment and the company Ben works for, we are not slaves. We are not owned by Horriber Test Automotive, as far as I know. And neither is anybody else. But we are obligated to serve them contractually, so that when we're at work, we are there to spend 100% of our time, not just flicking the internet or stuff like that, but actually to do work for them and do what our employers wish us to do. So, the next thing, the servants are supposed to obey their masters, their employers, in everything. Not just in the bits of employment they feel like doing, the bits that suit them, but in what they're asked to do. And it's not with, it says here, to curry favour, or some people even put with eye service. That is when we are being watched or observed, and when our boss is there. That's not the only time when we do what they say. We do it when they're not looking as well. And we don't even do it so that we'll get brownie points for our employer. Because we're not doing it to please them, or because we like them, or somehow if we do what they say, they'll like us. We're not even doing it to get recognition. We know that there are other people at work, and you've probably known them, who seem to do very well because they're very good at saying what the boss wants them to say. They're always there to be seen when they need to be seen, and none other time. And they get rewarded, they get recognition. But that's not our concern, because we're doing this for different reasons. We're doing this for the Lord's sake. We do it for Jesus' sake. This is a challenge in the modern workplace. I mean, we work, my son and I, we work remotely, so we're not in the office, so our boss is never actually watching us. And so we could be actually doing anything. We could be actually reading the newspaper, or we could be doing all sorts of things. And so it's a challenge for Christians in today that when they're not being watched, which is most of the time, that they are serving not simply their boss, they are serving the Lord. Now, you may not be appreciated. What you do may never be recognised or rewarded. But get this, one day, Jesus one day will reward you. For slaves in those days, they would never get any inheritance from their masters, even if he died. By law they couldn't. But they would from Jesus. And then just after this, there's a kind of bit of a kicker. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favouritism. And this is a kind of bridge passage. People say, well, who does it apply to? Is it to servants, or is it to what follows, the masters? And I'd say it's a bit of a both. It's a transition between these two verses, and a warning to both that whether they are servants or masters, and particularly for the last bit where it says there's no favouritism, that the Lord will reward you. It will come to you in the end. You may be employer here, but your earthly status carries no weight. And that brings us on to masters. Chapter 4, verse 1. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. Now, some people are a bit shocked, actually, saying, well, yes, Paul, you're talking about this. Surely shouldn't you be saying, slaves of the world, unite, masters, free all your slaves. And he doesn't. And some people have been puzzled by this. I think the first point is Paul is dealing with the world as it is and as it was. He couldn't change that. He is dealing with society as it was found. The slaves couldn't change it either. So it was no help to them in being radical about freeing yourselves. And it was for the gospel that they worked as well. So if you think about it, everything he said to the slaves is they're doing it for Christ's sake. And they will be rewarded for it. The second thing is actually there were laws being put in place from actually 2 AD onwards which restricted the number of slaves an employer could actually free. So at one point, eventually, they couldn't free anyone under the age of 30. If they had a certain size household, they could only free a restricted number. And I think the other one was that for sometimes those who were freed from slavery, their freedom was a miserable existence, that they were far worse off than they could ever have been. Freedmen in Rome, often in terms of the freed populace, were worse off than a lot of people in households. But he carries on, Paul says, provide for your servants right and fair. It's way beyond what slaves could ever expect. And Paul is saying to them, you have obligations. Just as the slaves had obligations to you, you have obligations to them. This is the way you serve them, they serve you, you serve them. And you've got to reward them fairly. You've got to reward them for their service. And think about this. You have a master, so don't be high-handed. Consider how he treats you, and consider your servants in the light of this, because Jesus treats you fair, and actually whatever position you have as master, he views you as no different to them. Now, in conclusion then, we've come across some fairly challenging, well I think are challenging stuff, because I wished I could be able to do all this. It's in the home, the marriage and work. But I appreciate here that there are people here who maybe are not married, maybe don't have children, and maybe are retired and don't work for anyone anymore. And you think, well, what's this really got to do with me? I've patiently listened to you for the last half an hour, quarter an hour, and there's nothing here for me. But there is. If you think about it, if we take this as the higher level, this is just what is spoken of from higher things. We have a husband, as Christians, those who believe in Jesus, we have a husband who is Jesus Christ. And he looks after us and cares for us in a way greater than any husband does. He has a relationship with us which transcends all human relationships and is eternal. And a word for, and I don't want to push this too far, but for those who are single, Corinthians makes plain that your potential relationship with Christ transcends any married person. You have a potentially deeper and more devoted relationship to Jesus than you would if you were married. We have a Father, the perfect Father, and we are his children. He never exasperates us. He does everything for our good. And we have a Master, Jesus Christ. We are his servants. He doesn't ask anything of us that is unreasonable, and he rewards us fairly and justly. Now, beyond this though, there is also the application of Jesus Christ, because those three areas of children who subject, wives who subject, servants who subject, you think, well, does God really understand that? Does God really know what these people are going through? Well, yes, he does, because Jesus Christ was the Son. He listened to his parents. He was subjected himself to his parents, even though he was Lord of all. He was a servant of all. Although he is Lord of all, he was servant of all. And like we said, he is the perfect husband. Now, life is not easy. We all know that. And I said from the beginning that this actually is challenging. Everyday life is challenging. But remember, why are we doing it? All the three difficult ones are, we do it for Jesus' sake. We do it for Jesus' sake. We do it for Jesus' sake. If there's anything we find hard, the Lord Jesus says to us, but will you do it for me, for my sake? And that changes everything. George Herbert was one of the 17th century metaphysical poets. And he's famous really round here because he actually lived near here. He's probably the only poet really I know who is famous from Shropshire. He was fifth son of the Lord of Cherbury and of Montgomery. And so he is kind of famous people. And if this has exhausted my local knowledge, so if you want to know any more, ask Anne Moll. Now, he wrote a lot of poems. And there's one quite famous one which Mike didn't seem to know, but let's hope everybody else does. It starts off, teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and what I do in anything, to do it as to thee. And it finishes this idea that if we have Jesus Christ in our lives, if we do things for his sake, it changes everything. He describes it as the famous stone that turneth all to gold, for that which God doth touch known cannot be for less be told. So shall we now sing our final hymn, which is, Teach Me My God and King, which is on the screen.